Good morning. Actually, it's morning here. It might not be morning where you're watching this. I'm Professor Bronstein, and welcome to the class. I have decided to make an introductory PowerPoint for week one in order to demonstrate what it is that I'm actually looking for in terms of these PowerPoints situating the reading and the film for the week in the larger theme that is listed in the syllabus. So we are going to be watching the film Birth of a Movement this week, which is about William Monroe Trotter and his attempt to bring together a movement to stop the screening of Birth of a Nation in Boston. And you're also going to be reading The Good Lynching and the Birth of a Nation, Discourses and Aesthetics of Jim Crow by Michelle Faith Wallace. And then you're going to go to the discussion area, follow the instructions very closely, and create a discussion post about the week's material. So in order to really understand where the situation in Birth of a Movement is coming from, it's important to know a little bit of background about race relations at the turn of the 20th century. And I should say that, we know the Civil War was a war fought about slavery between 1861 and 1865, that in the immediate post-Civil War period, there were high hopes for a post-war settlement that would make um, some reparations for the enslavement of African Americans, 4 million of whom were freed from slavery at the end of the Civil War. The Civil War amendments were passed between 1863 and 1870. That is the 13th Amendment, which eliminated involuntary servitude except as punishment for a crime. There's still that loophole in there. The 14th Amendment, which provided for birthright citizenship. So all persons born in the United States are citizens. And then the equal protection of the laws was also a central part of the 14th Amendment. And then the 15th Amendment, passed in 1870, gave African Americans the right to vote. Well, this was a short-lived set of victories because the Supreme Court in the last quarter of the 19th century rolled back a lot of the protections that were thought to be inherent in these amendments. So just to give you an example, a Civil Rights Act was passed in 1875 that would have given African Americans equal access to all kinds of amenities, including schools and public transit and individual businesses and hotels and theaters. Just really any place that was open to the public would have had to serve people equally without any regard to their race. But the Supreme Court said, no, actually, that is unconstitutional. The 14th Amendment does not provide for that. And as a matter of fact, in the wake of that decision, which really neutered the 14th Amendment, individual states passed a series of laws that came to be called the Jim Crow laws. Why were they called the Jim Crow laws? There was a character in a sort of musical theater called a minstrel show who was named Jim Crow. He was sort of an exaggerated blackface character that went along with a song called Jump Jim Crow. So the Jim Crow laws were passed in many states to guarantee that African Americans could not associate with non-African Americans in many different fields and ways. So they were excluded from public schools in many states. They had to attend segregated schools if schools even existed. They had to sit separately on buses, train cars, sit in separate parts of movie theaters and other theaters. They were completely excluded from things like public places of recreation, like swimming pools. So all kinds of ways in which African Americans were excluded. They were not allowed to intermarry with white people. And in 1896, a test case was brought to the Supreme Court by a man named Homer Plessy, in which he attempted to contest this idea that separation of the races was allowed in the United States. And the Supreme Court decided that, in fact, as long as equal amenities were provided for African Americans, separate but equal was just fine. Separate but equal was the standard under which laws would be judged in the United States until it was finally discredited in 1954 in the case of Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. So, Birth of a Nation is one of the first feature films that was ever made in the United States. And of course, it was made in this milieu, in this backdrop of extreme power differential between Black Americans and white Americans, in which Black Americans, as a matter of fact, were in often physical danger due to the phenomenon of lynching, in which somebody could be accused of a crime, whether or not they committed that crime, they would be held in the local jail, and then a mob would break them out and kill them, usually by hanging, and then perhaps take souvenirs of their dead body, burn the corpse, pose for photographs, right? So it was a time when race relations were really at their lowest point in America. Well, Birth of a Nation was a movie made by David Griffiths, who you will learn about in Birth of a Movement. It goes into his background quite a bit. This was a movie that romanticized the Confederacy, the losing side in the Civil War era South. It is a film that expressed a lot of nostalgia for what it was like before the Civil War. It showed enslavement as really a beneficial institution for African Americans, and one in which they were very happy and it was enjoyable and it was sort of the right way for people to be allocated their positions in society. The movie was based on a book called The Klansman, which was a best-selling book at the time. And so basically, D.W. Griffiths created a feature-length film celebrating the Klan. The Klan rides to the rescue, spoiler alert. And it was famous not just because Griffiths functionally innovated a lot in filmmaking, which he did, and it was one of the first feature films made in the United States, which it was, but also because Woodrow Wilson, who was the president at the time, had it screened at the White House. He loved the film. He said it was like history written with lightning. So not only was it a extremely sort of racist film, as you will get the details of when you watch Birth of a Movement, but also it had the imprimatur of the most powerful people in the United States at the time. We often call this celebration of the Confederacy and the Civil War the lost cause narrative. And in the period of Jim Crow, a lot of Southerners adhered to the idea that there had been an important racial order that had been subverted, an important cause that had been lost when the South lost the Civil War. Some of the tropes that you will notice in the film Birth of a Movement, it shows lots of clips of Birth of a Nation, and some of these are also mentioned in the article. Some of the main black actors are white actors in blackface. One of the villains of the film is a Union soldier who has now been demobilized. His character's name is Gus. You can see a picture of him there in the slide. And Gus falls in love with a white woman and chases her through the forest. And she is so afraid of him that she throws herself off a cliff rather than fall into his clutches. And so it sets up the trope that African Americans were predators against white women. The Klan rides to the rescue. Another part of the movie, Birth of a Nation, that's quite interesting is that it goes into some detail about what state governments were like in the South after the Civil War amendments were passed. Because in the short run, um, people who fought for the Confederacy or who served in the Confederate government were excluded from higher office. A lot of African Americans, including former slaves, served in Reconstruction legislatures, and you will see the way in which the Birth of a Nation um, creates the notion that this was a terrible betrayal of white people. It was the worst time in our nation's history, that people who had these positions were utterly unsuited to state government or other forms of higher office. Right, so those are some of the tropes that you will see in Birth of a Nation. And then finally, I have prepared some discussion questions, and I'm going to write these in the discussion area in addition to having them here. So I'm not going to go ahead and read those out loud to you, but do note that I have included a picture here of 3 African American men who were lynched in North Carolina in 1906, and that this sort of photography was the backdrop for a lot of the decision by the activists against Birth of a Nation, who you're going to see described in Birth of a Movement, as they attempted to protect their community against white predation. All right, so that is an example of the way in which your group might do a PowerPoint. I actually went into a little bit more detail than I expect most of you to do. That's why I said 10 minutes or fewer. So let me know if you have any questions. Okay, thanks.